right, thank you all for joining us today for our carbon sequestration in Monterey County workshop. And for those of you attending on Zoom, hope everything is going to work electronically for this. So thank you all for your participation today. I'm Norm Brute. I'm the Executive Director here at Monterey County Farm Bureau. And with that, I guess we are ready to start with the presentations. Okay, let's go ahead and start with Ashley. She's available to move up a little bit from the agenda.
All right. Okay. So thanks everybody for joining. I am the County Sustainability Program Manager and really excited to be talking today about sequestration and its relationship to our climate action plan and the agricultural industry in Monterey County. My colleague Olivia Garcia is there, so Olivia could wave to everyone. And I know we also have some folks from the Ag Commissioner's Office on the phone, maybe there in person as well. So the first thing I wanted to share is, just what is a climate action plan? Why is the county developing one? If you haven't been involved yet, this is just to give you a quick understanding of what we're working on at the county. So a climate action plan, this is the plan that my program is working on. And it's basically the county is taking a look at all of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions that are in the unincorporated area that it has jurisdiction over. And then we are kind of looking at the target for where we want to be in the future in terms of our emissions. So our target is a 40% reduction by the year 2030. So we're taking inventory of all of the sources of emissions and projecting that out to the future to see where we're going to be in 2030, comparing that to where we'd like to be, and then setting strategies that can help us to reduce our emissions. The county's general plan requires the county to do a climate action plan. It's a mitigation measure to our environmental impact report. So it's something that we were meant to undertake and are working to complete now. And I think one of the benefits of doing a climate action plan is that it gives us a chance to evaluate all the different kinds of strategies that exist to reduce emissions and what the kind of trade-offs, costs, or co-benefits might be to those different strategies, like all at the same time. So, we can really see what it might look like to reach our goals and what kinds of changes that would mean for the county. And I think one of the really good things about this is that it gives us sort of like a strategic edge in terms of kind of the green economy and where we see additional jobs being created as well. So that's kind of the overview of the climate action plan. And our climate action plan in Monterey County, it doesn't just look at the sources of emissions. Part of the scope of our climate action plan is to also look at sequestration. And we felt that this was a really important area for the county to look at. It's not typically included in climate action plans because a lot of climate action plans might be done at the city level. They really don't have the same kind of vast natural and working landscape that we do here. And that natural and working landscape is what really contributes to sequestration of carbon. So that's, the storage of carbon in the ground or in the soil or in the vegetation. And so I know we're going to be talking a lot about sequestration in this presentation, but I did just want to clarify that the difference between carbon storage and carbon sequestration before I share some numbers with you. So carbon storage really refers to the existing carbon that's already stored in the vegetation and soil, whereas carbon sequestration looks at that annual rate. So that's, the yearly uptake of carbon. And this is kind of the number that I wanted to focus on in my presentation. We had our consultants take a look at the natural working lands in Monterey County and provide us with some estimates of the carbon that's being sequestered on an annual basis. So I'm going to flip to the next slide. And we're going to be talking about this quite a bit, but this is kind of the breakdown of how we think the natural and working lands are sequestering carbon in Monterey County. And so what you'll see here is that down here at the bottom, at a minimum, we think that the lands are sequestering around 400,000 metric tons of carbon a year. And at a maximum, we're looking at 300 million metric tons of carbon a year being sequestered in all of the lands in the unincorporated Monterey County. And there's quite a bit of a range is what you're seeing there. And that variation is kind of due to some differences in annual kind of variations and things like weather and so on. So the major variation kind of comes, I think, here in the grass and shrublands. So what you're seeing, excuse me, there is that it can really vary whether the grasslands are sequestering carbon or emitting carbon throughout the course of the year, depending on kind of some of those variations. And then the bulk of the carbon is really being sequestered by the forests and the grass and shrublands. That's where you're seeing the kind of the maximum, the greatest amount of sequestration happening annually. And that makes sense because they have more woody structures and so on, and vegetation. And then in terms of our agricultural lands, we're looking at, a minimum sequestration annually of about 1 million metric tons of carbon and a maximum of about 3 million. So some variation there as well, but a little bit less. And kind of the bulk of that, I believe, is in our kind of our orchards. So again, those more kind of woody species. And our AMBAG, our local metropolitan organization, is going to be conducting a sequestration study for the Monterey Bay region that's going to sort of build on this work and expand it. But as far as the scope of the climate action plan, we just wanted to get a sense of, this side of the equation in the development of the plan. So these are just some kind of big numbers to throw out. Definitely doesn't tell, the whole story. We're not looking at things necessarily on like a crop by crop basis. This is a little bit more higher category organization than that. And then this is sort of just like the visual depiction of what you saw on the previous slide. So no new information here, just a different way of looking at everything. Okay, so on the flip side, we did also, of course, tally the emission sources in the county, in the unincorporated area. And there's definitely quite a bit of differences between how you calculate your emission sources and your emission sink, which you saw on the last slide. So I just want to kind of point that out. On the previous slide, with sequestration, we're talking about, we looked at all the land in Monterey County. So that included things like federal and state land, whereas the emission sources are only things that the county has jurisdiction over. So this is just county unincorporated lands. So that's one of the major differences. I just want to point out, we're not necessarily comparing apples to apples here. And the sequestration side, the natural and working lands, data sets and equations it's kind of like an evolving science. So we're continuing to refine that data as we move forward, whereas the emission sources are a little bit more kind of concrete. We're getting a little bit more granular data sets here. So what you see is that the majority of our emissions are coming from on-road transportation, and also a significant portion coming from agriculture and non-residential business energy. And I guess I'll just mention that the county's emissions profile is really different than a lot of other climate action plans that are done at the city level, for instance. And one of the reasons is because obviously we have a lot more space here, much bigger and more rural county. So we're traveling a lot further to get to our destinations. And also we've got a really big agricultural component that you don't see in a city inventory. And then in addition, we've already really cut our emissions on the energy side because of our Central Coast Community Choice Aggregator, 3CE. And they are providing zero carbon electricity to the majority of our buildings in the county. And so that means that the emissions from our buildings makes up a much larger or smaller, portion of the pie overall. And so that's kind of why the percentages are sort of shifting. Okay, and then the last slide, because I think I'm taking up too much time already, that I wanted to share is some of the agricultural inventories that we've seen in other counties. And so this shows you how much agriculture is as a percentage of the total in some other counties, which is interesting, but I actually think what's the most interesting to point out here is the kind of comparison between Monterey and Ventura, because what you can see is that their agricultural inventory in just absolute numbers, right, is very similar to ours. That's 260,000 approximately metric tons of carbon. But we have, I think, more than double the acreage. Almost double the acreage. And we have more than double the value in terms of agricultural production. So we are emitting less on a value basis as well as on an acreage basis. So that really points to some of the sustainable activities that are kind of already taking place most likely here. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting comparison. Turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you. Supervisor Lopez on.
Yeah, thank you, Norm. Just appreciate the opportunity and want to thank everybody for taking time out of your schedules to be here today to help contribute to this conversation. I think that's the important piece for me as we've gone through this process, which has been not an easy one, not a short one, but what we need is accurate information. We need to draw the best information that we can into this plan. And we know that doing that can be difficult because often that information feels very personal, especially with what we live and do every day. And often the industries in our communities that we have targets on our back. I'm not going to say we feel like we do. And it's a challenge, but this isn't that. This is, as Ashley said, a product of the general plan that we have put together, and leading this process from the county side has been our Alternative Energy and Environment Committee, along with Ashley, to make sure that we have a product that at the end of the day is accurately reflecting what is happening within the boundaries of our county. So as we go through this process, I hope that you'll continue to engage, reach out, and know that when you've spoken up as an industry or as an individual, it has made a difference in that we are listening to your information and prioritizing it as a key source. Right. And I see partners from all over Monterey County here, and it's the same for every single person on this call. We want to make sure that the data that you feel is impacting you gets vetted. And so we have committed, and Ashley, I know, and I have worked really hard back and forth several times to make sure that we take our time to produce the best plan possible. We're not trying to slow down. We're trying to make sure that what we produce is an accurate picture of what can happen in terms of a different sort of plan. I don't want to say we're following a cookie cutter boilerplate plan here. We're doing what we can to make sure that the sources of information we're using within our county are the best that we have access to. So I want to thank everybody who's taking part in today's presentation. And we are going to be here to listen, to take information in. But I encourage you as we move forward to continue to engage with us, because it's that engagement which helps us produce the best plan possible, the best report possible for Monterey County. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Norm. Thank you, Norm.
All right, so we're going to move into our presentations now, and our first one is from Jennifer Moore, who is with USDA ARS located in Oregon, and she's going to give us an overview of crop sequestration in croplands.
Thank you. My name is Jen Moore, and I'm a research soil scientist with the Forage, Seed, and Cereal Research Unit up here in Corvallis, Oregon. And I'm very honored to be here today and want to thank the organizers for this special invitation. Up here in Oregon, I work on soil health, carbon sequestration, and greenhouse gas emissions under different management and production systems, primarily in the grass seed and cover crop seed industry, with a focus on our growers here in the Willamette Valley. I've been asked today to give you an overview of soil carbon sequestration, introduce the soil health principles and practices that support climate mitigation goals. I will start with an overview of some of the major threats to California agriculture due to climate change, introduce the soil carbon cycle, and 2 key soil organic matter pools that are important for sequestration and crop production. I will then present the soil health principles and practices relevant to climate mitigation and resiliency, and then very briefly introduce you to 2 tools that may be helpful in estimating the carbon sequestration potential of many of the practices at both county and farm levels. And so there are numerous threats to agriculture from climate change. And quite honestly, I feel a little bit silly summarizing these for you because really California agriculture, you're on the front lines of climate change impacts due, in the agricultural sector. I'm sure many of you could give me direct examples on your farms where climate change has already had an impact on production, yield quality, water dynamics, pest pressures, and also impacts on farm workers. But in any event, just want to kind of set the stage here. And according to the Central Coast Summary Report as part of the California 4th Climate Change Assessment, the Salinas Valley was identified as one of the most vulnerable agricultural regions under climate change. Increased temperatures and increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events are national threats to agricultural systems. And again, California, you are right on that front line of a lot of those impacts. Specifically, the duration and intensity of drought has hit California particularly hard. And as you're well aware, extreme drought further stresses the already stressed irrigation systems and thus threatens yield and quality of the crops grown. At other times in the area, they may experience excessive precipitation, causing flooding, limiting access to fields, damaging crops, and increased risk of negative impacts on water quality. And then often associated with drought is that excessive heat that we are currently experiencing right now, which further threatens those water sources. It also disrupts flowering and pollination of crops and can increase pressures from weeds, insects, and diseases. So all of these things further, exacerbate the impacts and the already, small margins on the crop production side. And again, as you're all too well familiar with, drought and high temperatures increase the wildfire risk that threatens homes, fields, animals, and farm workers exposed to smoke. Additionally, ocean warming and increased sea level rise threatens the agricultural lands directly near the coast, and saltwater intrusion obviously has negative impacts on the quality of the irrigation water available. And then what's unique to the valley is the unknown impacts on the coastal fog and how that might change due to climate change. The modelers are working pretty hard on that to try to figure out what those predictions are, but that's a really unique characteristic of the Salinas Valley, and at the moment they're unclear as to what might happen due to climate change. But all of these impacts negatively impact the financial stability and security of the farm. And so nationally, agriculture is responsible for about 595 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So they take all the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and a few other trace gases, and they put them all in the same playing field and typically report in carbon dioxide equivalents. That's what's here. This is from the EPA inventory from 2020. Nationally, we're at over 5,000 million metric tons total. And then the agricultural activities responsible include those releasing primarily nitrous oxide or methane. And that's in contrast with the #1 greenhouse gas, which is CO2, that drives most of these national and global impacts. So from agriculture, the management, the contribution of greenhouse gas emissions primarily comes from agricultural soil management, and that's primarily related to nitrogen fertilization and the release of nitrous oxide. Also, enteric fermentation represents about a third, manure management about 13%, and then there are smaller contributions from rice cultivation, urea fertilization, liming, and field burning of residues. So to combat climate change, we not only need to reduce these emissions of nitrous oxide and methane, and there are lots of programs and practices that specifically address those, but we also need to increase the amount of carbon that is stored or sequestered. And that's the focus of the talk today. So one pathway to draw down carbon from the atmosphere is through carbon sequestration in soils. This slide illustrates the major global carbon sinks for carbon. A sink is basically where that carbon is stored and approximately shows how much in gigatons. And a gigaton is equal to 1 billion metric tons. And if I did the math conversion correctly, that's about 2.2 trillion pounds. So lots and lots of carbon stored in our oceans. This is our biggest sink. But what I really want to drive your attention to is the amount of carbon that's stored in our soils. And so relative to the atmosphere, soils store 2 to 3 times more carbon and up to 5 times more carbon than in all the vegetation on land. And so because of the dynamic of carbon in soil, how we manage our soils can have a major impact on the global carbon budget. And beyond the scope of this and beyond our regional focus, how the permafrost reacts is going to really have an impact. So obviously protecting those lands is pretty critical. So there's lots of different ways to talk about carbon cycling and carbon storage and sequestration. One way that I have heard and have now adopted is to think of it as a carbon bank. And so like a bank, there's a constant flow of money, or in this case, carbon in and out of the account. Globally, since the mid 1800s, agricultural soils have lost up to 75% of the amount of carbon that was initially present. In other words, a substantial withdrawal has been made from the global soil bank. However, with increased adoption of agricultural conservation practices, there is great opportunity to capture more carbon dioxide above ground, as well as increase the deposits and store more stable carbon below ground. And so the best way to increase the amount of carbon we can store in soil is to increase the amount of organic matter. And that's because about half of soil organic matter is carbon. So practices that help rebuild organic matter and soil carbon, you're familiar with cover cropping, conservation cover, conservation tillage and residue management, diversified crop rotations that include perennials, and when appropriate, integrating livestock, not necessarily a common one in Monterey County, but in the global sense it is. But the harder questions, right, are how much more, what kind of time frame is that going to take, and what is it going to take to get us there? So in a very simplified version of the carbon cycle, right, carbon dioxide is absorbed by plants and converted via photosynthesis to biomass. And during the process, plants release some of this carbon through their roots that helps to stimulate soil microbes. And then these soil microbes are imparting lots of important functions for the health of that plant, right? Nutrient cycling, protection against pests, the formation of stable soil aggregates, et cetera, et cetera. The microbes and plant roots are also releasing some of that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere as they decompose organic residues and are respiring. Increasing how much carbon can be stored in soil, therefore, starts with increasing the amount of residues added to the soil, both above and below ground, through increased carbon inputs. So while we want to increase the amount of carbon that's stored below ground, sequestered long-term, we also must acknowledge and realize that it also is really important to have a more labile pool that cycles through the plants, through the microbial communities, and back out into the atmosphere. This is what keeps the engine going. So if we hoard 100% of all the carbon we put in the ground, then the whole engine fails. So it's a balance between increasing inputs that store carbon long-term and also providing fresh labile inputs that can keep that engine kind of going. And so the overall goal is to choose practices where additions of inputs and the formation of organic matter is greater than the removal and losses. Right? So simple, right? But not really. And so this may be a little bit more than you signed up for, but just amuse me and let me nerd out for a second on a couple of really key organic matter fractions. And so there are two pools of, let me back up. Organic matter is a complex array of different elements and compounds and structural components. And it's too broad to just measure total organic matter and think we have any idea of what's happening, through processes and mechanisms. And so scientists split apart that organic matter into different pools. Two of the most important pools that have been brought to the attention with climate change scientists are what's called particulate organic matter, or POM, or mineral associated organic matter, or MAOM. And so the POM fraction is made from the fragmentation and translocation of plant litter and residues. It tends to be relatively light. It has a high C to N ratio. And according to the authors of this book chapter that have identified these two fractions as key in understanding carbon sequestration, they propose thinking of POM as the checking account, right? It receives money every payday, but it gets spent quickly to cover everyday expenses. So this pool is really important for that cycling and keeping that engine going. In contrast, the MAOM, the mineral associated organic matter, that's your savings account. It usually receives less money from each paycheck, but that money isn't spent as quickly. And so this organic matter is formed as soluble, dissolved organic matter is solubilized from the decomposition of those residues. And these compounds can then directly attach to soil minerals and become protected, or they may go through the microbial biomass. And as those microbes die and decompose, their necromass, or that dead microbial cellular constituents, then binds directly to the mineral fraction. And why I bring that up is because it emphasizes the importance of a healthy, robust, active microbial community in not only supporting all those other functions, but also in supporting organic matter and carbon sequestration. So it kind of changes our view of how we manage our soils. The POM lasts like 1 to 50 years, whereas that MAOM, again, the sequestration, we want it more longer term and protected in the soil. That can last up to about 1,000 years, given the current research. So these are two really important pools that scientists can explore and understand. And when we do that, that's going to help us improve the models and the understanding so we can make more accurate and more confident recommendations. All right, enough of that. So to increase carbon storage in agricultural fields, that's through sequestration. We can also maintain carbon through good management practices. And what we absolutely want to avoid is the loss of carbon. And that can be through accelerated decomposition, such as that's found in bare fallow fields with intensive tillage and low carbon inputs and return to that bank account. It also can occur through the loss of soil through erosion. So these are the the processes that we want to avoid as much as possible. We don't want to lose any more than we already have. We want to at least maintain those levels. And in an ideal situation, we want to sequester or store more. Storage of more is most easily accomplished in areas that either have a yield gap or are in a degraded state already. So there's a high carbon sequestration potential. So as an example, growers I work with out here in Oregon describe how they will take over land that has been under less than ideal management conditions and apply the soil health practices that they know work because they've done them on other fields in their farming system. And on these lands, after they transition the more degraded land following the practices that they know are successful, they report significant increases in organic matter as well as in yield and the quality of their crops. However, back on the farms that they are modeling these practices for, there isn't a lot of room for improvements. And that might also be the case for many of the farmers in Monterey County. You're doing as good of a job as you can. You're returning residue, you're minimizing disturbance, you're following the soil health practices. And this maintenance is really important, and it's an overlooked value that many of our farmers actually help to maintain those large carbon storage pools that were talked about earlier. And so quantifying that, getting an accurate inventory, and then communicating how it's important to protect those carbon pools and not lose that through conversion to development or other, land use practices that can accelerate that decomposition. We need to value that and recognize that that's a really important function that our growers are already doing. And then in these other systems that have the potential, many of them can increase the amount of carbon that is stored, then we can prioritize and go after those goals. And then I also need to point out that there's a maximum level that all soils can have. You can't just keep adding carbon to infinity. There's a saturation level that's driven in large part by a lot of variables. Some we can't control, some we can. So one of the ones we can't control is soil texture, the amount of sand, silt, and clay in our soils. In general, soils that are finer textured, have more clay and silt, have the ability to sequester more, and they have a higher maximum potential than our sandier soils. Temperature and moisture, we can control that to some extent with our management practices, but the overarching climate of a region is really driving that maximum threshold potential for carbon sequestration. What we can control through land management and land use practices is the amount and quality of those carbon inputs. And so again, those that are high quality, high carbon returning residues, deep rooted plants that can get carbon deeper into the profile are strategies that we want to try to maximize to increase the amount of carbon that can be sequestered. Anything basically that improves plant productivity tends to be good for carbon sequestration because, again, the amount of residue and carbon being returned to the soil is the step one for carbon sequestration. Finally, because of the importance of soil biota and especially those dead microbial cells, practices that support a diverse, active, and abundant community is desirable. And then finally, nutrients are needed and can't be overlooked. So if we're going to increase carbon, that requires extra amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, other nutrients. And so what we want to make sure we do is to try to support practices that allow us increase amounts. We want to increase soil nutrient levels, tighten those nutrient cycles, and minimize losses. And so how can we do that? Through adding a legume cover crop to the mix, adding a legume in the rotation, emphasizing enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and then of course, really solid irrigation and water management strategies to help minimize those losses. So we want to not rely more on synthetic inputs, but trying to maximize the biological nutrient cycling in soils. So again, we want to choose practices that simultaneously increase the amount of carbon that can be stored in those long-term savings account, that Mayon fraction, and increase that high quality, more dynamic particulate organic matter that can make regular withdrawals to maintain crop productivity and soil biota. So those practices we want to support are those that provide high quality residues, increase the root biomass, not only overall, but at depth, because there's lots more potential the deeper we go in soils to sequester more below ground. If we increase root exudates, we're supporting that active microbial community. And specifically, our bustular mycorrhizal fungi have been associated with increasing the amount of that long-term storage pool, the Mayon fraction. I already mentioned increasing soil nutrients through biological nitrogen fixation and emphasizing more efficient nutrient cycling. And then other practices such as kind of shortcutting some of these, applying directly compost and mulch applications, preferably those that are formed on farm, are good strategies. So in general, most of the outcomes of these practices I just described fall under one or more of the soil health principles. And I'm sure you're really familiar with these, so I won't belabor them, but they're minimize disturbance, maximize cover, maximize biodiversity, and the presence of a continuous living root. I kind of like to distill these down into two principles, and that's simply protect the soil aggregates and the organic matter, and to feed and fuel that soil biological community to create the aggregates and the organic matter. And Karen is going to go into much more specific details about the practices used in the county. I'm not even going to attempt to pretend I understand your complex and diversified system. So that I'm not touching at all, and we'll leave that up to the experts in the area. But before handing it over, I want to emphasize that there, again, is no one size fits all solution. Many practices can achieve similar goals. So what is encouraged is to build flexible programs that are adaptive and create both short and long-term plans to best strategy, is the best strategy to maximize success. Prioritizing practices in one commodity or one practice or in one part of the state or even county will likely be very different for a different crop. And so you have to have that site specificity and that flexibility to adapt to figure out what works best given the resources you have at hand. And again, it's important to note that agriculture is a system. And so we have to view it that way rather than focusing specifically on a single practice for a single particular goal. Today, we're talking on a specific particular goal, that's carbon sequestration, but there are many co-benefits of supporting soil health management systems that are also equally impactful and beneficial. So there are two tools I'd like to introduce you that may be helpful. Depends on your goals and where your mindset is, but one of them was developed specifically for the Healthy Soils program of the California Department of Food and Ag. So this tool is Comet Planner. And there's one for the whole country at the county level, but again, there's one that was specifically developed in collaboration with CDFA and the California Air Resources Board that again provides estimates for reductions that are specific agricultural management practices that are included in the CDFA Healthy Soils programs. It's also unique because it has estimates of payments that are associated with implementing the practices under HSP. It was developed quite a few years ago, and I don't know how relevant it is today, but I just wanted to make you aware of it. It's really easy. It takes no training. It's super high level, right? So these are broad averages at the county level. You select your county, you select your agricultural system, and then one of the many conservation practice standards. And then within each practice standards, there are conservation planning objectives that best describe your project. It gives you a high level average expectation. If every land acre in the county did this, this is on average what you might expect to see. It is not site specific, and I really can't emphasize that more. So I just put in 100 acres. You can put whatever in here. It just enables you to look at the values, different practices. So crop rotation, cover crop with a legume, a non-legume, mulch, residue tillage, and tillage management, in this case, converting from intensive till to reduced till, strip cropping, compost. So a whole bunch of different practices that you can put in. And then what you look at is this total CO2 equivalent reduction potential. You can see that there's a wide range, adding compost, especially a C-to-N ratio greater than 11, has a huge impact on carbon sequestration potential and reductions in overall greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a big range also in the amount that is expected from legume and non-legume cover crops, with legumes providing a lot more. So you have to kind of decide what your goal is. If your goal is carbon sequestration entirely, then you might choose a legume cover crop. But if your goal is to, recapture some of the nitrogen, perhaps that is wasn't taken up during the cropping season, and recycle that, it's important to choose like a cereal or a non-legume cover crop. You can also mix these to get different benefits as well. So there's trade-offs to all of these. So looking at it from just a carbon sequestration lens is just one piece of the puzzle. And I encourage you again to think of the whole system. I wanted to point out these negative values mean that there's actually increases in some of the greenhouse gases, namely nitrous oxide, for some of the practices. So you actually increase the amount of nitrous oxide with the legume cover crop, but luckily that's offset by a larger value in the amount that can be stored in carbon sequestration. So your net is always positive in this particular example. Again, they are average values based on modeled results. And as the COMET team emphasizes, the estimates are not meant to apply to any specific site conditions, but rather represents the range of expected values to be found over this multi-county region that they modeled it at. So it's a good place to start. It's certainly not a place to end. If you're really ambitious and you really want to know a little bit more about site-specific inputs, you can use Comet Farm. It is designed to be a carbon footprint for all or part of your farm, and it allows you, it actually caters to site-specific climate conditions, as well as the soil database, the Surgo database. So it does take into consideration that. The downside is that it's pretty data intense. You have to input all of these different components of your management practices going back like 20 years and then forward going. There are some tricks and tips to get around that, input emphasis, but then you get less accurate results. Again, these are average values. These are estimated. And the models, are only as good as the data that go into them. And so, these models that are built behind the scenes, the one that estimates the reductions in greenhouse gases are the same ones used by the EPA inventory team. So they're, pretty robust, but, it's an expectation. And so measuring and quantifying and testing are absolutely encouraged. And as us researchers get more data, we improve the models, we validate those efforts, and we gain more confidence. So it's an evolution. And then in summary, ag soils store vast amounts of carbon. Most have the potential to store more, but there may be other limitations beyond those biophysical, the economic, the social, the cultural limits that may limit that potential. In addition to adding more carbon to soils, we have to value and quantify the amount that's already present, that's already being managed by our growers that are doing excellent jobs. And again, we can't hoard all of it. It's cycling. So we need different forms of carbon, different residues, different qualities to help keep that engine going. And I can't emphasize more the co-benefits of developing these management systems that impact water and air quality, biodiversity, and resiliency. And again, you got to kind of know where you're at to know where you can go. And so quantification and measurements and improved inventories across the nation and region are critical. I think I probably just went over, but I really appreciate your attention. There's probably no time for questions, but I do have my email here and my cell phone, and feel free to reach out to me at any time if you want to nerd out on carbon sequestration and different pools. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions in the room here? Yes, go ahead.
So I saw a definition of POM and then the MAOM or MAOM, but what was the EOM? What's that definition?
The dissolved organic matter is really important for helping to form this MAOM. So as the plant residues, if you just wash leaves and different carbon, plant residues with water, or, as a rain event or irrigation, there's a certain amount that is soluble in water, and it will just, leach through the soil. And again, that helps to stimulate the microbes. And it also helps support the formation of this MAOM. So the dissolved organic matter is what's released through the solubilization, what can be extracted from water leaching through that residue and through the soil. And then those compounds can keep going, or they can be attached to minerals, those clay minerals and silt particles in the soil that can then protect that organic matter from further microbial attack. Hopefully that's
Yes,
good.
thank
So nobody measures it, or very few do. It's a pretty small pool, but it's a really important pool that helps to feed and stimulate the microbes.
Yeah, thank you, Norman. Thank you, Jennifer, for your presentation. It's very informative. I'm just wondering if you have looked at biochar as a potential mineral. Maybe you include that in your composting, but as a means of carbon sequestration and improving your mayo.
Yeah, excellent question. So biochar is gaining a lot of attention. One of our scientists here at the ARS in Corvallis, Dr. Kristen Tripp, put together a Pacific Northwest biochar atlas. And we are currently in the process of developing our next 5-year plan. And we'll specifically be adding biochar and actually something basalt dust, but that's another conversation, to look at that additional carbon sequestration potential and then the effects on multiple other functions. But biochar, depending on how it's formed and, the feedstock source, can be a really valuable agricultural amendment for sure. Mm-hmm. And I'll also say that her team is working very closely with NRCS, and we are working with carbon modelers to include that particular component in some of the practices and whatnot. So we hope to have more information about that in the coming years.